An elderly woman is accused of theft by a rich woman, but the owner defends her. Look at what happened. Subscribe so you don't miss our exciting stories. Grace Thompson had spent 43 years cleaning other people's homes, and in all those years, no one had ever called her a thief. Until today. The accusation hung in the air of the luxurious penthouse apartment like poison, making it hard to breathe. "I know it was you who took my diamond tennis bracelet." Margaret Blackwood's voice cut through the silence, sharp as a knife. She stood in her designer suit, perfectly manicured finger pointing at Grace's chest. "It was right here on my vanity yesterday morning, and now it's gone. You're the only one who's been in this room." Grace's weathered hands trembled as she clutched her cleaning supplies closer to her chest. At 68 years old, she had endured many hardships in her life, but nothing had prepared her for this moment. The cleaning cart she had pushed through countless hallways now felt like the only thing keeping her upright. "Mrs. Blackwood, I swear I haven't taken anything." Grace's voice was steady, despite her shaking hands. "I've been cleaning homes my entire life. My reputation—" "Your reputation," Margaret laughed, the sound echoing off the marble floors. "Do you think I care about the reputation of a cleaning lady? That bracelet was worth $50,000. I've already called the police." Grace felt the floor sway beneath her feet. The police. In her entire life, she had never even gotten a parking ticket. She thought about her grandchildren, about the Sunday dinners where they looked at her with such pride. What would they think when they heard their grandmother had been arrested? The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, but instead of police officers, Alexander Chen, the building's owner, stepped into the penthouse. His presence commanded attention, though his expression remained calm and measured. "Mrs. Blackwood, I received a rather concerning call about a theft," he said, his eyes taking in the scene before him. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately." Margaret's perfectly painted lips curved into a triumphant smile. "There's nothing to discuss, Mr. Chen. This woman has stolen my diamond bracelet, and I want her arrested immediately." Alexander raised his hand slightly, a gesture that somehow managed to quiet even Margaret's indignation. "Before we make any hasty decisions, I believe we should review the security footage." Grace's heart skipped a beat. Security footage? Of course, the building had cameras everywhere. Relief flooded through her body, but it was quickly replaced by a new fear. What if something had happened to the bracelet and she was being framed? What if— "That won't be necessary," Margaret interrupted, her voice losing some of its earlier certainty. "I know what happened to my property." But Alexander was already pulling out his tablet, his fingers moving swiftly across the screen. "Actually, Mrs. Blackwood, I insist. As the building owner, I have a responsibility to ensure the safety and security of all our residents, and that includes protecting the reputation of our staff members who have served this building faithfully for years." Grace watched as Alexander's eyes narrowed slightly at whatever he was seeing on the screen. The tension in the room grew thicker with each passing second. "Mrs. Blackwood." Alexander's voice had taken on a different tone, one that made Margaret's confident posture falter slightly. "Would you mind explaining why the security footage shows you placing your bracelet in your safe last night at 11:42 p.m., long after Grace had left for the day?" The color drained from Margaret's face. That's impossible. I specifically remember leaving it on my vanity this morning." The footage also shows you entering your safe again this morning at 7:15 a.m., about an hour before Grace arrived for work. Alexander turned the tablet around, allowing both women to see the clear security feed. "Would you like to revise your accusation?" Margaret's mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. Her perfectly manicured hands began fidgeting with her designer blazer. Grace stood perfectly still, watching as the truth unfolded before her. She had spent decades building her reputation, earning the trust of countless families, only to have it nearly destroyed in an instant by a careless accusation. Alexander's voice cut through the tension once again. "Mrs. Blackwood, I believe you owe Grace an apology, and perhaps we should discuss the terms of your lease agreement." specifically the clauses regarding false accusations against building staff. The silence that followed was deafening. Grace could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears as she waited for Margaret's response. But something told her this was just the beginning of a much larger story, one that would reveal truths about wealth, power, and dignity that neither woman had expected to confront that morning. The truth about the bracelet had been revealed, but Grace could sense that Margaret's accusation wasn't really about a missing piece of jewelry. There was something deeper at play, something that had driven this wealthy woman to try to destroy the reputation of a humble cleaning lady. And as Grace stood there, still clutching her cleaning supplies, she realized that this confrontation would change not just her life, but the lives of everyone involved in ways none of them could have anticipated. Margaret Blackwood's carefully constructed facade began to crack. Standing in her luxurious penthouse, surrounded by evidence of her wealth, she suddenly seemed smaller, more vulnerable. Her perfectly manicured hands trembled as she reached for her safe, entering the combination with unsteady fingers. I need to check something," she mumbled, her earlier confidence evaporating like morning dew. The safe door swung open, and there, nestled among other expensive pieces, lay the diamond tennis bracelet that had nearly destroyed Grace's reputation. Alexander Chen's presence remained steady and authoritative. "Mrs. Blackwood, I believe we're waiting for that apology." But Grace was watching Margaret with different eyes now. Through decades of cleaning homes, she had developed an ability to read people, to understand the stories hidden behind their carefully maintained appearances. Something in Margaret's demeanor had shifted. This wasn't just embarrassment over a false accusation. "Mrs. Blackwood," Grace said softly, surprising both Margaret and Alexander. "Would you like me to make you a cup of tea?" Margaret's head snapped up, her eyes wide with confusion. "Tea? I just accused you of theft, and you're offering to make me tea." "Sometimes," Grace replied, moving slowly toward the kitchen, "people lash out when they're hurting. And I think you're hurting quite a bit, Mrs. Blackwood." Alexander watched the interaction with interest, his tablet still displaying the damning security footage. The dynamic in the room had shifted completely, and he sensed there was more to this story than a simple false accusation. As Grace prepared the tea, a task she had performed thousands of times in countless homes, Margaret sank into her expensive leather armchair, her composure continuing to crumble. "I received a letter yesterday," Margaret finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "From my son's lawyer." Grace placed the delicate teacup on the side table, noting how Margaret's hands shook as she reached for it. Alexander remained silent, but his presence ensured the truth would come out. "My son is suing me for control of the family company," Margaret continued, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "He claims I'm mentally incompetent, that I've been making irrational decisions. He wants to take everything I've built, everything I sacrificed for." The revelation hung in the air like heavy smoke. Grace remembered seeing family photos around the penthouse. A handsome young man in expensive suits, always standing slightly apart from his mother in every picture. "This morning, I couldn't find the bracelet, his father's last gift to me before he died. I convinced myself." Margaret's voice trailed off, shame coloring her cheeks. "You convinced yourself that if you could prove someone had stolen from you, it would show you were still sharp, still in control," Grace finished for her, understanding dawning in her eyes. Alexander stepped forward, his expression grave. "Mrs. Blackwood, falsely accusing an innocent person is not the way to prove your competence. In fact, it could have severely damaged both Grace's reputation and your own standing in this building." Margaret's shoulders slumped. "I know, I've spent 30 years building this company from nothing. After Richard died, everyone expected me to sell it, to let the men take over, but I proved them wrong. I made it stronger, more successful than ever, and now my own son..." Grace sat down across from Margaret, her work uniform a stark contrast to the luxury surrounding them. "Mrs. Blackwood, I raised 3 children cleaning other people's homes. My youngest, Michael, he wanted me to retire years ago. Said he could support me with his fancy law degree that I paid for with decades of scrubbing floors. Margaret looked up, surprised by the parallel in their stories. But this work, Grace continued, gesturing to her cleaning cart, it's not just what I do. It's who I am. It's my dignity, my independence, just like your company is yours. Alexander watched the interaction with growing interest. He had known both women for years, Margaret as his highest-paying tenant and Grace as his most reliable employee, but he had never seen either of them quite like this. The difference is, Grace said, her voice gentle but firm, I'd never let my pride hurt others to protect what I had built. There's no dignity in that, Mrs. Blackwood. The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. She looked at the security footage still displayed on Alexander's tablet, at the evidence of how her fear had nearly destroyed an innocent woman's life. I'm so sorry, Grace, Margaret finally said, and this time the words carried the weight of true remorse. You're right. I was so afraid of losing control that I became exactly what my son accused me of being, irrational, paranoid. But Alexander wasn't finished. While I appreciate your apology, Mrs. Blackwood, actions have consequences. Grace has been a valued member of our staff for 15 years. Her reputation is beyond reproach, and yet you were willing to destroy that reputation to serve your own purposes. Margaret nodded, accepting the rebuke. What are you going to do? That, Alexander said, looking at Grace, will depend partly on what Grace wants. As the wronged party, she has every right to press charges for defamation. Grace sat quietly, considering the weight of the moment. She thought about her own children, about the lessons she had taught them about forgiveness and dignity. But she also thought about justice, about consequences, and about the responsibility that came with power and privilege. The decision she would make next would affect not just her own future, but would ripple through the lives of everyone in that room, leading to consequences none of them could have anticipated. The simple accusation of a missing bracelet had uncovered deeper truths about power, dignity, and the price we pay to maintain our pride. Grace sat in Alexander Chen's office the next morning, her worn hands folded neatly in her lap. The morning sun streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating a space that perfectly balanced luxury with understated elegance, much like the man himself. Alexander had called this meeting to discuss the formal response to yesterday's events, but Grace could sense there was more to it than that. Mrs. Blackwood's son arrived this morning, Alexander began, his fingers drumming lightly on his mahogany desk. Benjamin Blackwood. He's demanding to meet with you. Grace felt her stomach tighten. With me? Why would he want to meet with me? Apparently news of yesterday's incident reached him rather quickly. Alexander's expression darkened. One of the other residents recorded part of the confrontation on their phone. It's not public yet, but Benjamin is using it as evidence in his case against his mother. Grace closed her eyes, remembering Margaret's revelation about her son's lawsuit. He's using me to prove she's incompetent. Yes, Alexander confirmed, but that's not all. Benjamin Blackwood has a reputation for being ruthlessly efficient. He's offering you money, Grace, a lot of money, to testify about his mother's behavior. Grace's eyes snapped open. Testify? He wants you to describe how she falsely accused you, how she appeared unstable and paranoid. Alexander leaned forward, his voice gentle but serious. He's offering you $500,000, Grace. The amount hit her like a physical blow. $500,000. More money than she had earned in all her years of cleaning. Money that could secure her grandchildren's college education, that could finally let her retire, that could change everything. Where is he now? Grace asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Waiting in the conference room down the hall. Alexander studied her face carefully. You don't have to meet with him, Grace. In fact, I'd strongly advise against it. But Grace was already standing, smoothing her simple dress with trembling hands. No, Mr. Chen, I need to meet him. I need to understand. Alexander rose as well, concern evident in his expression. Then I'm coming with you. The conference room was another study in understated luxury, with its polished table and leather chairs. Benjamin Blackwood stood as they entered, and Grace immediately understood what Margaret had meant about feeling like she was losing control. Benjamin was the perfect image of corporate success. Tall, impeccably dressed in a suit that probably cost more than Grace made in 3 months. With his mother's sharp features, but none of her current vulnerability. His smile was practiced, professional, and didn't reach his eyes. "Mrs. Thompson," he extended his hand, "thank you for meeting with me. I understand you've had a rather unpleasant experience with my mother." Grace shook his hand but didn't sit down. "Your mother apologized for her mistake, Mr. Blackwood." "Ah, yes, the apology." Benjamin's smile turned slightly predatory. "Tell me, Mrs. Thompson, how many times has my mother had similar episodes? How many other employees has she accused without cause?" "This was the first time," Grace answered firmly. Benjamin raised an eyebrow. "Really? You've never noticed any other erratic behavior? Any signs of paranoia or confusion?" "Your mother was afraid," Grace said simply. "Fear makes people do things they regret." "Fear?" Benjamin laughed, but there was no warmth in it. "My mother hasn't been afraid of anything in her life. She's been too busy terrorizing everyone around her, destroying anyone who gets in her way. Did you know she fired my father's entire board of directors the day after his funeral?" Grace remained silent, but Alexander stepped forward slightly, his presence a reminder that this wasn't Benjamin's territory to control. "They were going to sell the company," a new voice said from the doorway. Margaret Blackwood stood there, looking both elegant and exhausted. They thought a grieving widow couldn't possibly run a manufacturing empire. They were wrong. Benjamin's face hardened. "They were trying to save the company from your inexperience. They were trying to steal what your father built." Margaret countered. "What we built together. And now you're trying to do the same thing. I'm trying to protect our legacy." Benjamin's composure cracked slightly. "You're becoming unstable, Mother. This incident with Mrs. Thompson proves it. You're paranoid, making accusations without evidence, embarrassing yourself and the company. Is that what this is about?" Grace's quiet voice somehow cut through the tension. "Embarrassment?" Both Blackwoods turned to look at her, seemingly surprised to be interrupted by the cleaning lady they were fighting over. "Mr. Blackwood," Grace continued, meeting Benjamin's eyes steadily, "I've cleaned your mother's home for 5 years. In that time, I've seen every award she's won displayed on her walls. I've dusted the photos of her at charity events, opening new factories, receiving honors from the governor. But do you know what I've never seen?" Benjamin's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. "I've never seen a single photo of you accepting an award. I've never had to dust any plaques with your name on them. Every achievement in that penthouse belongs to your mother or your late father." The color drained from Benjamin's face. "How dare you? You're not worried about your mother's competence." Grace pressed on, her voice still gentle but firm. "You're worried because she's better at this than you are. She always has been, hasn't she?" Margaret drew in a sharp breath, while Alexander watched the scene unfold with growing admiration for the elderly cleaning lady who was speaking truth to power. "I don't have to listen to this," Benjamin snarled, reaching for his briefcase. He pulled out a document and slapped it down on the conference table. $500,000, Mrs. Thompson. All you have to do is sign a statement about my mother's unstable behavior, about how she's becoming a danger to herself and others, about how she needs to be removed from her position for her own good." Grace looked at the check, at the amount that could change her life. Then she looked at Margaret, seeing not the wealthy woman who had accused her, but a mother watching her child try to destroy her. "Mr. Blackwood," Grace said softly, 30 years ago, I cleaned offices at night while studying for my GED during the day. My children were small, and people told me I was foolish. They said I should focus on surviving, not dreaming of something better. But I knew that my children were watching me, learning from every choice I made." She turned to Margaret, whose eyes were filling with tears. "Yesterday, your mother made a mistake. She let her fear overcome her judgment, and she almost hurt me in the process. But she admitted her mistake. She apologized. She showed that even powerful people can learn and grow. Finally, Grace faced Benjamin again. "What are you teaching us about yourself with this check, Mr. Blackwood?" The silence that followed was absolute. Benjamin stared at Grace, as if seeing her for the first time, not as a pawn in his game, but as someone who could see right through him. "Keep your money," Grace said, turning away from the check. "I won't help you hurt your mother to soothe your own wounded pride." Alexander stepped forward, gathering the papers from the table. "I believe we're done here. Mr. Blackwood, I'll have security escort you out." Benjamin's face contorted with rage. But before he could speak, Margaret raised her hand. "Wait, Benjamin, sit down, please." To everyone's surprise, he did. Margaret looked at her son, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time in years. "You're right about one thing. I have made mistakes, but trying to destroy me won't make you stronger. It won't make you more capable. It will only prove that you're exactly what those board members said I was 30 years ago. Someone who has to tear others down to build themselves up." The tension in Alexander Chen's conference room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Benjamin Blackwood sat rigid in his chair, his mother's words seemingly having struck a nerve that his expensive suit couldn't protect. Margaret remained standing, her posture straight but her eyes soft as she looked at her son. Grace and Alexander watched the scene unfold, knowing they were witnessing something far more significant than a simple business dispute. "Do you remember," Margaret began, her voice gentle, "when you were 7 years old and you insisted on coming to work with your father and me?" Benjamin's jaw clenched, but something flickered in his eyes. A memory, perhaps, or a moment of vulnerability he couldn't quite suppress. "You wore your little suit, the one that matched your father's." Margaret continued, moving slowly to sit beside her son. "You were so proud, carrying your toy briefcase, telling everyone you were going to run the company someday." "Mother, this isn't—" Benjamin started, but Margaret raised her hand slightly, and to everyone's surprise, he fell silent again. "That day, one of the board members, old Harrison Matthews, he patted you on the head and said, 'Good thing you're here, boy. Your mother's going to run this company into the ground without a man to guide her.'" Margaret's voice carried the weight of 3 decades of similar comments. "Do you remember what you did?" Benjamin looked down at his hands, and for a moment Grace saw not the polished corporate lawyer, but the little boy in his father's shadow. "I told him he was wrong," Benjamin said quietly. "I said you were the smartest person I knew, and that you could run anything better than anyone." "You defended me," Margaret agreed, reaching out to touch her son's hand. "You were so fierce, so certain. When did that change, Benjamin? When did you start believing the Harrison Matthews of the world?" The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken pain and years of misunderstanding. Grace found herself holding her breath, recognizing the delicate moment unfolding before her. "When Dad died," Benjamin finally said, his voice cracking slightly. "Everything changed when Dad died. You changed." "I had to," Margaret replied softly. "The vultures were circling, Benjamin. They thought I would be easy prey, the grieving widow who would sell cheap just to avoid the fight. But you didn't just fight them." "Mother?" Benjamin's voice gained strength, old hurts rising to the surface. "You became obsessed. The company became everything. You missed my college graduation because of a merger meeting." "I missed your graduation," Margaret acknowledged, pain evident in her voice, "because if I hadn't closed that merger, we would have lost the Eastern Division. 3,000 jobs would have disappeared. Your father's legacy would have been dismantled piece by piece." "And what about my legacy?" Benjamin demanded, standing up so suddenly his chair rolled backward. "While you were saving the company, who was saving our family? When was the last time we had dinner together without discussing profit margins or market shares?" Alexander moved to intervene, but Grace touched his arm lightly, shaking her head. This confrontation had been brewing for 30 years. It needed to happen. "The company was supposed to be our legacy, yours and mine," Margaret said, remaining seated, looking up at her son. Everything I did, every fight I fought, was to preserve what your father built for you, but somewhere along the way, I forgot to show you that. Show me what? Benjamin's voice was bitter. How to be cold, how to sacrifice everything for the bottom line. No. Margaret stood slowly, her eyes never leaving her son's face. How to be strong without being hard, how to fight without destroying, how to lead without intimidating. All the things your father taught me, all the things I thought I was teaching you by example. Grace stepped forward then, her quiet presence drawing everyone's attention. If I may, she said softly, sometimes the lessons we think we're teaching aren't the ones being learned. Benjamin turned to look at her, his expression a mix of confusion and lingering anger. What would you know about it? I know that children watch everything we do, Grace replied calmly. My youngest son, he used to get so angry watching me clean other people's homes. He thought it meant I was less than them, that I was sacrificing my dignity for money. Margaret and Benjamin both stared at her, caught by the parallel to their own situation. It took years for him to understand that my work wasn't about being less, it was about being more. More than my circumstances, more than other people's judgments. Grace smiled gently. Just like your mother's work was never about the company itself, Mr. Blackwood. It was about proving that someone's worth isn't determined by other people's expectations. Alexander stepped forward then, his presence commanding attention. Perhaps, he said thoughtfully, this situation calls for more than legal documents and accusations. Mrs. Blackwood, when was the last time you took a vacation? Margaret blinked, surprised by the question. I can't remember. And Mr. Blackwood, Alexander continued, when was the last time you worked alongside your mother, not against her? Benjamin's defensive posture faltered slightly. Not since before father died. Then I have a proposal, Alexander said, moving to his desk and pressing a button on his phone. Janet, could you please bring in the Morrison proposal? His assistant entered moments later with a thick folder, which Alexander opened on the conference table. The Morrison Group has been trying to acquire one of my properties for months. They're aggressive, well-funded, and unfortunately very good at hostile takeovers. They've already bought out 3 of my competitors. Margaret's business instincts visibly kicked in. The Highland Tower deal? I heard rumors about that. Yes, Alexander nodded. They're notorious for buying properties, laying off staff, and maximizing short-term profits at the expense of long-term stability. They've made an offer on this building. Grace felt her heart skip a beat. This building had been her workplace for 15 years. These people were like family. What are you suggesting? Benjamin asked, his legal mind clearly engaged, despite his emotional turmoil. I'm suggesting, Alexander smiled slightly, that instead of fighting each other, you two might consider helping me fight them. Mrs. Blackwood's strategic experience combined with Mr. Blackwood's legal expertise. It could be interesting. Mother and son looked at each other, years of hurt and misunderstanding hanging between them, but also something else, a glimmer of their old connection, of shared purpose. It would require working together, Alexander continued, as equals. No power plays, no ulterior motives, just a mother and son putting their considerable talents to use for something bigger than themselves. Grace watched as something shifted in Benjamin's expression. The Morrison Group. They're the ones who tried to force out that elderly housing complex in Brooklyn last year, aren't they? Margaret nodded, her business acumen showing through. Yes, and they nearly succeeded until someone leaked their internal memos to the press. That was brilliant legal work, actually. The way they structured the... She trailed off, looking at her son with new understanding. That was you, wasn't it? You represented the housing complex. Benjamin straightened his tie, but couldn't quite hide his smile. Pro bono. They reminded me of Gran before she had to go into a home because we were all too busy with the company to care for her. The moment hung between them, fragile but full of possibility. Alexander watched them carefully, while Grace stood quietly, witnessing the potential for healing that she had hoped for, but hadn't dared expect. So, Alexander said, shall we discuss strategy? or would you prefer to continue with the lawsuit? 3 months later, Grace stood in Margaret Blackwood's penthouse, carefully arranging fresh flowers in a vase. The morning sun streamed through the windows, catching on a new photograph that had recently appeared among Margaret's collection of achievements. A picture of mother and son smiling together at the opening of a community center for elderly residents, funded by the Blackwood Foundation. The door opened, and Margaret walked in, looking more relaxed than Grace had seen her in years. Behind her came Benjamin, his tie loosened, carrying a stack of papers. "Grace!" Margaret's face lit up. "I was hoping you'd be here. We have news." "The Morrison Group withdrew their bid this morning," Benjamin announced, his pride evident not in arrogance, but in genuine accomplishment. Mum's idea to involve the Tenants Association was brilliant. When they realized they'd have to fight the entire community, not just the ownership. "We make a good team," Margaret said softly, looking at her son with undisguised affection. Grace smiled, remembering the past 3 months. The late-night strategy sessions she'd witnessed while cleaning the conference room, the gradual thawing between mother and son as they worked together instead of against each other. The lawsuit had been quietly withdrawn 2 weeks after they started working on the Morrison case. "Actually, Grace," Benjamin said, setting down his papers, "we have something else to discuss with you. Mother and I have been talking. We want to offer you a position," Margaret continued. "Not as a cleaner, but as our community relations director for the new foundation." Grace's hands stilled on the flowers. "I don't understand." "You showed us something important," Benjamin explained, his voice carrying none of its former condescension. "About dignity, about the value of every person's work and worth. The foundation isn't just about writing checks. It's about understanding the real needs of the community. Who better to help us than someone who has spent decades working with and understanding people from all walks of life?" Margaret added. Grace looked at the mother and son, seeing how they now stood together rather than apart. "I'm honored," she said carefully, "but I'm not sure I'm qualified." "You're more qualified than anyone." Alexander's voice came from the doorway as he joined them. "You've already been doing the job informally for years, looking out for the elderly residents, helping the maintenance staff navigate difficult situations, building bridges between people who would never otherwise connect." Grace thought about her years of cleaning, of the lives she had touched and the stories she had witnessed. She thought about her own children, about the lessons she had taught them about dignity and worth. "I'd like to keep cleaning," she said finally. "Maybe not full-time, but this work has value too. It's part of who I am." Margaret and Benjamin exchanged glances, and Alexander smiled. "How about this?" Margaret suggested. "You take the foundation position, but you also train our cleaning staff. Teach them what you've taught us, about dignity, about seeing people as people, not just their positions or possessions." Grace felt tears welling in her eyes. "I would like that very much." Later that evening, as Grace prepared to leave, she paused by the photograph of Margaret and Benjamin at the community center opening. Next to it was a new frame. Inside was the torn-up check for $500,000, mounted alongside a simple handwritten note. "Some things are worth more than money." Benjamin appeared beside her, looking at the framed check. "You know," he said quietly, "when you refused that money, you didn't just save my mother's position. You saved our relationship. You saved me from becoming someone I wouldn't have liked very much." "Sometimes," Grace replied, thinking of her own journey, "the most valuable things in life are the ones that can't be bought or sold." As she left the penthouse that evening, Grace thought about how a simple accusation over a bracelet had led to so much change. Margaret and Benjamin were healing their relationship, working together to make a difference in their community. Alexander had protected his building and its residents from corporate takeover, and she, a cleaning lady who had once been accused of theft, was now going to help guide a foundation dedicated to preserving dignity and opportunity for others. Walking through the lobby, Grace passed the spot where, 3 months ago, She had stood accused and afraid. Now she walked with her head high, knowing that true dignity wasn't in what you owned or what position you held. It was in how you treated others, in the bridges you built, and in the wisdom to know that every person's worth went far beyond their circumstances. The evening sun cast long shadows through the lobby windows, but Grace Thompson stepped into the light, ready for whatever tomorrow might bring. She had spent her life cleaning other people's homes, but in the end, she had helped clean something far more important: the wounds in a broken family's heart. What would you have done in Grace's position? Would you have taken the $500,000 to secure your future, or would you have chosen dignity and principles over money like she did? And here's another question to think about. Do you believe Benjamin and Margaret's relationship would have healed without Grace's intervention? What was it about her simple wisdom that helped bridge the gap between mother and son? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective on this powerful story of dignity, family, and redemption. If you enjoyed this story of how a humble cleaning lady changed the lives of a powerful family, you'll love our next video. It's a touching tale of love, social class differences, and unexpected revelations that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Don't forget to hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss any of our upcoming stories. And if this story touched your heart, give it a thumbs up. It helps us create more content like this. See you in the next video.